Now that we've been introduced to forms, at least the main elements of forms, let's see how we can use a form, render a form, and process a form, that is, within our Python application, within our Flask application. Okay, so if you are not where we are in terms of being in your Hello Flask directory and having Visual Studio Code opened up, go ahead and pause the video and take a second to do those two things. All right, and so now we're in this environment. Let's go ahead and get our application ready to run. We need to activate our virtual environment so that we can run our Flask application. So to do that, we want to type source activate hello Flask, which is the name that we gave this virtual environment. And I misspelled activate. There we go. And Hello Flask is the name that we gave this environment when you set up the Hello Flask application in a previous tutorial. Okay, so hit enter. And if that does its job, we see the name of the virtual environment on the left of my command prompt right here. Okay, and so I'm not going to start up the application just yet. We'll do that in a moment. Let's go look at the code for this application. Okay, so I'm going to close out this form. We're not going to use that now. Let's go to our main.py file, our main.py. And here I want to do two things through this lesson. First is to change my index handler, so instead of displaying the message hello world, which is all that it currently does, that it returns some HTML that consists of a form that the user can interact with. Okay. The second thing I want to do is then write some code to handle that form submission, and I want that code to basically be something that can customize a hello world type message. So if the user were to type in hello Chris and submit the form, it would say accordingly, hello Chris in the response. All right, so let's go ahead and do the first of those two steps. So what I want to do here is create a global variable in my main.py file. I'm going to call it form, and I'm going to give this triple quotes. So triple quotes, recall, those will allow us to build a string that goes across multiple lines. Okay, and that's what we're going to do. I want to put just a bunch of HTML here in a big long string. Rather than piecing it together, I want to build it up using these triple quotes. All right, so we'll do that. And okay, so I basically just want to write some HTML here. I want this to be a form similar to the one we wrote in the last lesson. So go ahead, doc type HTML, add some HTML tags. And I'm going to need a body. I don't need a head quite yet. So let's make a body. And then within that body, we'll make a form. Okay. And let's leave off the action and method for now, because we just want to focus on the rendering of our form. When we're ready to process our form, we'll customize those attributes of the form tag. Within the form, I want to create a single text input and a submit button that allows the user to type in their name. So we'll say that we want an input of type equals text. And I need to give every input a name. So this one I will call, I would say name equals name, but that can get kind of confusing when you're getting new to when you're new and getting used to HTML forms. Let's call this first name. Okay, it'll be the user's first name. All right, that's the input elements. I need a submit button as well. So making input type equals submit. That input does not need a name. That's the one exception to that rule that we've been using. And then I want to give this a label again for usability, so the user knows exactly what we want them to do. So let me make a label tag. And let me say that this is for the first name elements, and that means I need to name the input or give it the ID first name. Okay, so there we go. So that's a form, right? This is pretty similar to the form we had in the last lesson. This should render like a form. It should have those nice usability components. Oh, I didn't actually put a label in here. Let me put this in. There we go. And now we're ready to render this in the page via our Flask application. So the way we can do this is we can just return, instead of returning a plain string here, I can actually return HTML. So let's go ahead and instead of returning hello world, we'll return the value of what's in the form variable. Okay, which we've defined up above as a global variable. Okay, let's go ahead and run our application and see if this works. So to run our application, I say Python main.py. Okay, and this is going to be running on localhost or 127.0.0.1. I'm just going to copy paste that into my browser. Okay, and so we see that similar before. I mean, what we see on the page is not significantly different from what we had previously when we wrote our form directly in an HTML file. The difference here now is that our form is being rendered via the application. So when I go to 127.0.0.1:5000, that makes a request. It doesn't just open up an HTML file. It makes a request to my Flask application server that we started running here, which is that's an important difference to realize, that what's happening here is that request is then being sent. We can actually see this request line in the console. This is the exact request log from me going to the browser and typing this in. If I hit refresh a couple times and come back, we see that we've logged multiple requests. So this is an HTTP request coming from my browser to the Python application that I'm running here. And that request is being handled by this index function. All right, so to review and reiterate what's going on here with this function, we're using the tools of Flask to specify that this function should receive requests at the root URL, at the route /, which is the same as just requesting something without putting a slash on the end. So this function will receive requests at that path. The application server, when it gets a request for that path, it will send that request to this function, and then whatever this function returns will be what is then returned to the user in their browser and rendered in the browser. Okay, so visually nothing's really different here from what we did before, but conceptually and functionally very, very, very different stuff going on. So want to point that out. And just to make that really clear, if I kill my Flask application by hitting Control-C and I come back and refresh, I can no longer access that form, right? So just to reiterate, this form is not a file. It's not something sitting on my hard drive or sitting on any flat file kind of location. It's something that's built on the fly by the server. And so if my server is running and I have it set up properly, I can come and load and I will get the form contained in that global variable. Okay, so that's step one, rendering a form within our HTML. You might say, hey, isn't this going to be pretty gross if we're building large applications with lots of HTML to put strings like this all over our Python files? Yeah, it is. We're not going to do it for that long. We want to kind of isolate the concepts that we're learning as we go. We'll learn about a technique called templating that will allow us to take our HTML out of our applications and to have it be rendered in more powerful, flexible, and clean ways. But for now, this is okay. So step two is to build a handler that will allow my form to be processed. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's say that we want our form to be submitted to a particular URL. Let's add an action. And let's say that we want it to be submitted to /hello. Okay, so if I do that, that means I need to come down and make a handler for that path. All right, so I can say app.route and say that the function that I'm about to define should handle requests to /hello. And so let me call this handler function just hello. Okay, and so this is what we want this to do at the end of the day, is to take the data that the user has entered into the form. The user will come to the form and enter in their name and hit enter. That will then, as we've seen, send that data to our server. Okay, we've configured our form right here with the action to send that data to the /hello route on our own server. We want this handler, which is now set up to catch that request, to handle that request, to get the name out of the request and then to greet that user by name. Okay, so that's the mechanics of what we want to do. So within this function, the way I can do that is first I need to access the request. I need some way of getting that data out of the request. And the way Flask does that is it gives us a request object. So I need to import that. So go up to the top of your file And just after you've imported the Flask class here, import the request object. Just put, from Flask, import capital Flask, comma, request. And this request object will allow us to, it's a way via Python to access the data that is in the request the user sent to our server. To access that data, I need to use the request object as follows. So first we want to note that based on the way our form is set up here, we don't have a method specified, which means, as we said previously, that the method by default will be a get request. So when I'm dealing with a get request in a Python Flask handler, I use request.args.get, and then I ask for that piece of data by name. So I gave the form element the name first name. I can use that same string to access that particular piece of data from the query string that Python, or Flask rather, will parse and make available via this request.args. I can access that using this syntax. And I want to put that in a variable. Let me call the variable first name as well. Okay, so now I have that specific piece of data in my request handler that I can use. And we said before that we want our code to just greet the user by name when they tell us who they are. So let's return a string of HTML that does that. So I'll make h1, and I'll say hello, and then I'll add their name, and then I'll add the closing h1 tag. All right, that looks pretty good. Let's go start up our server and see if it works. Okay, so I'm going to refresh just to make sure that form is still there. We didn't change any of that code, but it still works as expected. And so now I can come in here, enter my name, and hit enter to submit the form. And we do see the greeting that we had hoped. That is the HTML sent back by our hello handler. Let's kind of inspect the details of what just happened. So look at the URL here. So as before, when we were just dealing with a plain HTML file, when we're using the get method to submit our form, all of those parameters get inserted into the URL after the question mark as key value pairs. So the value of the first name input is going to be after the label first name. And that's, if I had more, these would be separated by an ampersand. If I had, say, last name equals, my last name, those would be separated by an ampersand. Okay, so that's the URL we're at. The code on the application side, when it received that request, notice the request was made to /hello. That's when we hit enter. That's because we configured our form action to be /hello. So the request was submitted to that particular URL with the query string appended to the URL. And so this handler was able to access the parsed query string. Flask parsed that and made that available as Python data. We were able to access that piece of data using request.args.get and using the same name here as we have in the input name. And then I was able to do something with that data. So this kind of flow of writing a form, configuring it to submit data in a certain way, receiving that data, doing something with that data, and responding is a simple way to summarize everything we're doing in Unit 2 for the most part, or a large class of things that we're doing in Unit 2. Now, the complication of those things is going to grow significantly as we go, but the mechanics will still be the same. All right, so let's look at how we can actually do the same thing with a post request, okay? So we talked about GET requests mostly so far. Let's look at how we can submit a form via post. So the first thing we have to do is specify in the form itself that we want to do a post request. So I have to say method equals post. This can be all caps or all lowercase. Browsers don't care about that. Now below, I'm going to need to modify my handler significantly to get it to receive a post request. And I have to do two particular things. One is when I'm working with my app.route decorator and I've specified the path there, I need to also specify the methods that this will receive. So I do that by saying methods equals, and then I give it a list of HTTP methods. Okay, and so in this case, I only want it to accept post requests. If I wanted to accept, say, both get and post, I could, it's a list, so I could put a comma there and put that right there afterwards. But in this case, I just want it to accept post. So let's leave it there. And now within my handler, if I want to access that piece of data from a post request, I need to use a slightly different syntax that Flask makes available. So I can't use this request.args.get to access a piece of data that was submitted via a post request. I need to instead use request.form. Oh, there we go. And then request.form is actually a dictionary-like object. So I need to use square brackets to access an element by name out of that dictionary-like object. So I have first name equals request.form, square bracket, string first name. That's the key of the piece of data that I want to access. Again, that maps to the name of the input element in the form above, and then I'll be good to go. So let's go ahead and make sure our application is still running. So just as a note, when you're running your applications, if you have this, we've kind of told you to put this at the top of your file and alluded to what it does for you. One of the things it does for you is as you're making changes to your Python code, it will go ahead and reload the application for you based on those changes. So you're not going to have to constantly stop and restart your Flask application, which is something you would have to do if you weren't running in debug mode. Sometimes though, if I were to say introduce some kind of like syntax error and save, and I come back here, the app's just going to crash because as it's trying to reload, it hits a syntax error and it says, "Whoop, can't do that. I'm done." All right. So just to note that it's handy to have this debug setting at the top so you don't have to constantly stop and restart. But occasionally you will have to go manually restart because you've done something that introduced a basic error. So just something to be aware of. If your app is not doing what you expect it to, check the console, see if it's still running, and see if you have an error message there in the console. Okay, so now I've got it started. Let me go back to my form and refresh just to make sure I've gotten the most recent version of that. Now this form should be set up to submit a post request. So let's go ahead and test it out. All right, so that seemed to work. We got the same message. A couple things are different though. Notice that we don't have any query parameters in the URL. So post requests will submit query parameters as part of the request body. Okay, and I'll show you exactly where that is by using our browser developer tools in a second. So we don't have that data exposed in the URL. So we definitely want to use post request most of the time, especially when we're dealing with sensitive data like passwords or credit card information. Okay, and notice also that the response was basically the same, but I had to access that data differently on the server. I had to set up my handler to handle a post request and then to access the request data differently using request.form rather than request.args.get. So Flask just gives you different ways to access post and request data, get and post data, and those are the two different ways. So let's do a couple things. One, I want to show you, like I said before, exactly what this request that just got submitted looked like. So let's go ahead and open up our browser tools. And on the network tab, go ahead and reload. Notice that when I try to do a refresh on a page that was created from a post request, I get this browser warning. Now, this is something you've seen before, for sure. This has definitely happened to you at some point on the internet in your life. And now we can understand why it's actually happening. If you submit a post request via a browser and then you hit refresh, that will attempt to make the same request. Post requests are generally meant to make changes to data. So a post request is something you would do when you say wanted to submit a credit card to purchase something, or to sign up for an email newsletter. Those would all be handled via post requests. If you refresh, that will trigger the request twice, and so it could conceivably maybe run that transaction on your credit card twice, which is not something you want to do. So browsers are going to warn users if they try to submit the same post request twice. So it said, hey, basically it says, hey, do you really want to do this? In this case, we actually do. We know that our request that we're about to submit is harmless, but in general, be careful with that. So now I see that I have this one request down in my network tab. A few things to note. Our status code is still 200. That means the request was received and handled and responded to appropriately. The method here now says post, which is good. File is basically the path, right? It's not really a file. We're requesting a path or a resource on the server. And let's see, if I click on this row, now I'll get some information about that request. And let's kind of blow this up. So again, we talked about this, the headers aspect of this tab here. Let's go to the params tab. And now I see that I still have first name :Chris. We saw this when we did our little search form in the last lesson, that we had key value pairs for the data that was submitted to the server. Now though, it's telling me that this is form data, okay? And so the difference between form data and query parameters when I'm looking at them on the front end here in my browser developer tools is the difference between a GET and a POST request. All right, so when you're debugging your application, if you're writing form code and submitting that to your application and things aren't working as you expect, this is one of the tools you can use to debug that process. You can come back and make sure that the form data that is being submitted to your application actually looks the way on the front end that you expect it to when it's received on the back end. Okay, so the browser tools are powerful and let you kind of see behind the scenes there. Okay, one more thing I want to show you before we conclude this lesson is something, a common error that you might have when you're doing this kind of thing. So let's suppose that we wrote our application this way and we forgot to set method equals post on our form. In other words, we have our form still set up to submit a post request or a GET request, but we have our handler set up to receive a post request. Okay, so let's look at what happens in that situation, because again, this is something you are likely to do as you're working on this stuff, especially early on. Okay, let me go back to my form and refresh it. And now when I submit, so two things. One, notice that we reverted our form to submit a GET request, so we see the query string up there again. But now I received an error message, okay? So method not allowed. This method is not allowed for the requested URL. So error messages, I think error messages should be our friends. They tell us information. They help us learn things. There's something really valuable to learn here about what just happened. And so let's kind of piece the different strands of this situation together. If we go to our terminal, we see that we looked at the last request line that was logged. The end of that line is the status code. That says 405. So depending on your browser, if you're using Firefox, Firefox isn't going to show you the status codes all the time. And depending on the browser or the site you're using, you might or might not see the HTTP status codes in the page when one of those errors happens. When we're developing, we can just go ahead and look at the terminal here and see the logged output and see that that's a 405 error. And so if you were to say Google, that status code, you would see some resources and you would, dig in and see exactly what's going on. But I can tell you exactly what's happening now. And I encourage you to go look up, 405 error on Wikipedia or something and read about it. But basically what's happening is that this error is triggered because we're submitting a request to a specific path. All right, so we're submitting a request to /hello, and that is a GET request. However, the way we've set up our application and the server to run is that this should only handle POST requests. So this is the server. The method not allowed error status code is basically the server saying, hey, I have something at that path, but you're asking for it in the wrong way. You're asking for it via a GET request. I am only able to give this to you if you ask for it via a POST request. Okay, so that 405 error, something you might see if you're setting up your stuff a little bit improperly on the back end and not having your form submission method match your form handling method. Okay, so something to be aware of. All right, great. So that concludes this lesson. We learned about setting up forms on our Python application servers, rendering a form via GET request, and using just some HTML, big HTML string there, and then handling that form by handling it via both GET and POST. We saw both ways to do it via a new handler by making sure that our action and our method matched the route, path, and the methods on that handler, and then dealing with that data within the form and responding appropriately. So before we actually say goodbye today, let's go back and actually commit our code. We made a bunch of changes here. Let's use Git to put those in our local Git repository. So I'm going to kill my server, and I will say git status to show me the status of what's happened. This is the file from last time that I haven't tracked, the forms.html. We did it in the last lesson. It shows that that's untracked. It shows us that our main.py file is modified. It's already being tracked, but it's been modified since the last commit. Let's go ahead and add both of those. We'll stage both of those for committing. Oops. And then now when I do a git status, I see both of those are staged and ready to go. Let's go ahead and commit. All right, there you go. So get used to the habit of regularly committing your code as you make incremental changes to your applications. So that concludes today's lesson. Thanks for checking this out, and happy coding.